Welcome to episode 74 of OTD, your daily dose of soccer history by 17 Laws Guy. It's January 13, 1907. We're in Turin, and today, a city that already builds Italy's cars is about to build one of Italy's oldest football arguments. It's Juventus versus Torino. The first Derby della Mole, named for the Mole Antonelliana, Turin's landmark and symbol. Torino has existed for barely 6 weeks. In their first competitive derby, they win. Torino 2, Juventus 1. So today we'll do three things. We'll explain why Turin ended up with two major clubs in the first place, and why Torino are, quite literally, born from a Juventus rupture. We'll walk through the first Derby della Mole, January 13, 1907, and why it immediately feels bigger than a normal match. And then we'll zoom out. Class, tragedy, dominance, famous matches, iconic players, the incidents that harden the rivalry, and the numbers that explain why one of Turin's two clubs has spent most of modern history chasing the other. And if you enjoyed episode 38, the first Derby della Capitale, consider this the northern counterpart, older, colder, and built on a different kind of split. So let's start with that. Juventus are founded in 1897 by students from prestigious Turin High School, and from early on, they carry a certain social texture. Educated, respectable, upward. Torino are founded in 1906, but not as a new club from nowhere. Torino are created when Juventus dissidents, led by Swiss financier Alfred Dick, joins forces with another Turin side, Football Club Torinese. That's the origin story in one line. Torino exists because a piece of Juventus leaves Juventus. And there's an even sharper detail. Dick holds the lease on Turin's early football ground, the Velodromo Umberto, a cycling venue that becomes football stage. So when Dick walks out, he doesn't just take people, he takes the room. Which means the first derby is staged on grounds that, in a sense, is already part of the feud. Now add the derby's deeper fuel, class. Until World War I, this match is explicitly described as a clash of social worlds, Juventus as the bourgeois club, later strengthened by the Agnelli bond beginning in 1923. And Torino rooted in the city's early industrial identity. In the 1960s and 70s, mass migration into Turin reshapes that map. Many southern workers arrive to work at Fiat and, ironically, end up supporting Juventus, the team of the boss, the team of Fiat. Torino remained the local claim, Torinesita, the original Turin spirit. That tension never disappears. It just changes costume. But now to this match. On this day, January 13, 1907, Torino played their first competitive match after founding on December 3, 1906, and it's the first Derby della Mole. And the result lands like a mission statement, Torino 2, Juventus 1. There's also a piece of derby folklore attached to this very first day. Alfred Dick, the man at the center of the split, is said to have been locked inside a changing room, unable to watch, forced to follow the match through updates and sound. Again, whether every detail is perfect or not, the symbolism is perfect. The founder listens to the birth of the rivalry through noise. And then the new club wins. A month later, Torino win again, 4-1, and Hans Kempfer scores 4 in a single derby, the first true derby destruction performance in the fixtures record. So the first chapter is clear. Torino arrived not to coexist, they arrived to compete for the city's crown. Now zoom out, and you'll see why this derby becomes a national reference point. It is widely treated as the oldest ongoing meeting between two clubs from the same city in Italian football, and it contains extremes that modern football almost never allows. Juventus' heaviest ever defeat, Juventus 0, Torino 8, in November 1912, and the highest scoring derby, Torino 8, Juventus 6, 14 goals in February 1913, and also Juventus' biggest derby win by margin, Juventus 6, Torino 0, in April 1952. These scorelines are not trivia. They tell you that derby has swung between chaos and cruelty, depending on the era's power balance. And the most important power swing in the derby's history is a story about grandeur that tragically ends in fog. We're talking about the Grande Torino era and Superga. In the 1940s, Torino became the best team in Italy. They win the league 5 times across the decade, including 1942-43, and then 4 straight titles after the war, 45-46, 46-47, 47-48, and 48-49. They supply the national team so heavily that Torino as Italy stops being metaphor and becomes selection policy. Their captain is Valentino Mazzola, the Derby's fastest goal record holder and the heartbeat of an era. And then, on May 4, 1949, the team's plane crashes into the Superga hillside in dense fog as it returns from Lisbon, where Torino had played a friendly against Benfica. The crash kills virtually the entire squad and staff, plus journalists and crew. We'll pay homage to Il Grande Torino with an episode on its own. And Torino proclaimed champions of 1948-49, and the season is completed with youth teams, Torino and their opponents fielding youngsters for the remaining fixtures. This is the gravity of Superga in one consequence. Torino do not win another league title until 1975-76, 27 years later. And that absence changes at Derby, because the Derby is never just local pride, it's a contest for status. Superga breaks Torino's football machine, and Juventus step into the long years of advantage. If you want the single most productive Derby scorer, it's Giampiero Boniperti. 14 goals in official Derby matches, a Juventus legend, whose name sits at the top of the list. And yes, it's that same Boniperti who later became CEO and chairman of Juventus. If you want the man who belongs to both sides, it's Guglielmo Gabetto. 12 Derby goals split across the divide, 7 for Juventus, 5 for Torino. And then he becomes part of Grande Torino, and sadly was on the Superga flight. If you want Torino's greatest Derby scorer, it is Paolo Pulici. 9 goals, the face of Torino's 1970s revival, the captain-era forward, who drags Torino back into Scudetto relevance. And that 1970s revival matters because it isn't merely Torino were good again. No, Torino go unbeaten in the Derby for nearly 6 years in the 1970s. And the 1975-76 title comeback includes the Derby as the hinge in the run-in. It's a 2-0 win at Juventus, which closed the gap with few rounds left, and in which Torino's keeper, Castellini, was hit by fireworks from the stands. Polici's strike partner in that era is Francesco Graziani, also a top-tier Derby contributor, 7 goals in official matches. And then there are names that remind you that Juventus' modern dominance didn't remove star quality from the fixture. It simply changed who usually gets to celebrate. Michel Platini, Gianluca Vialli, Pietro Anastasi, Omar Sivori, all present in the Derby's top scorer tier. In other words, the Derby has always attracted serious footballers. What changes is how often Torino's serious footballers are allowed to turn quality into a win. Now the incidents, because this rivalry has never been purely aesthetic. In 1967, after a 4-0 win to Torino, Juventus fans vandalized the grave of former Torino player Gigi Meroni, one of those moments where Derby hatred crosses into something uglier. In 2001, Torino pulled off a 0-3 to 3-3 comeback, aided by a notorious act of gamesmanship. Torino midfielder Riccardo Mespero grooves a hole on the penalty spot before Marcelo Salas takes a penalty and misses. In the return match, Enzo Maresca's late equalizer celebration parodies the bullhorns gesture, another small act that becomes a lasting provocation. And yes, this was 25 years ago, yet it's the very same Enzo Maresca who was Chelsea's manager until January 1st this year. And in 2012, the first league derby at Juventus Stadium, there are arrests before kickoff for brawling and vandalism, and the match ends with fines. Juventus for an offensive banner referencing Superga, Torino for vandalism inside the stadium. The derby does not always deliver violence, but it has always carried the potential for it, because it isn't merely a match, it's a civic argument. Now to the modern power imbalance, because this is where listeners need the blunt numbers. The last derby was played on November 8, 2025. It is the 215th competitive fixture. Juventus has 96 wins, Torino has 56, and they have drawn 61 times. Those totals still don't fully capture the modern story, because the modern story is streaks. Torino's 2-1 win on April 26, 2015 is framed as their first derby success in 20 years, the end of a drought stretching back to 1995, but the deeper meaning is harsher. It's Torino's only derby win in the last over 30 years. That's the modern Derby della Mole. Juventus don't just lead. They've turned the rivalry for long stretches into a controlled environment where Torino can draw, sometimes threaten, sometimes erupt emotionally, but almost never win. Which is why 2015 is remembered as seismic. It didn't just break a spell, it exposed how strong the spell had become. So what should we take away from January 13, 1907? As always, 3 points. First, this derby begins as a split, not a coincidence. Torino are born from Juventus dissidents and a merger, a club created to contest status, not to share it. Second, class is not a footnote here. Juventus become the club of the bourgeois, and later fiat, a national reach. Torino remained a local identity, and that social geography is still part of how the derby is felt. And third, the derby's emotional weight is shaped by tragedy and dominance. Superga wipes out a dynasty and breaks Torino's competitive continuity. Juventus's advantage hardens into decades, where Torino's victories become rare historical events, not routine outcomes. On this day in 1907, Torino win the first derby. Over a century later, that first win still matters because it proves what the rivalry has always been trying to answer. Who owns Turin? And for the past 30 years, the answer has been Juventus. That's all for episode 74 of OTD, the first Derby della Mole, Juventus versus Torino on January 13, 1907. If you have a favorite Derby della Mole memory, Superga commemorations, the Polici years, the 0-3-33 madness, or that 2015 day when Torino finally won again, email me at otd@17lawsguy.com. Tips and corrections are always welcome. Please rate us 5 stars, subscribe, and tell a friend. Daily Soccer History Podcast don't climb on their own. Tomorrow, in episode 75, we go to 1969. Matt Busby steps away, and English football has to imagine Manchester United without the man who rebuilt it. See you then.